Now, this being a data structures class, most of the work for this project is going to be on building and implementing some kind of data structures, not on all the various pieces of glue that power this web browser-based tool. So in particular, in 2a, we're going to have you build two data structures called time series and n-gram map. That's going to be most of the work. Time series I think of as a warm-up that will be somewhat challenging, and then n-gram map I'd say will be more challenging. Okay? So those are the two main classes you're going to build for this project. So let me talk about them briefly. So the time series class represents a series of data points per year. So for example, if we make this larger, if I create a new time series, which is an object you're going to make, then I can associate the number 3.6 with the year 1992. Or we can associate the number 9.2 with the number 1990, with the year 1993, and so forth. So it obviously maps that idea of a history of a word, right? So if we look back here, this is a time series, this yellow line and this blue line. So you're going to implement this time series class. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but it's going to have essentially four methods: one that returns all the years, one that returns all the data, one that can sum two time series, and one that can divide two time series. I could divide the current time series by another. Okay? And so with these methods, you'll be able to support the process of doing that visualization. And one interesting thing about a time series is that it is an extension of the tree map. So if I go to time series starter, which in your code will just be called time series, you'll see that it extends tree map integer double. In other words, it is a tree map that maps integers to doubles, and that maps, or that corresponds to what we see here, right? So that's a time series. And so here I'm not giving you a full description. The spec is there for you. You can learn all the little nitpicky details there. The other thing you're going to build is an n-gram map. So what does an n-gram map do? Well, crucially, what it does is you give it two data files, right, that are described in the spec, that are all the data in some raw form, and it creates an n-gram map that will now be able to collect data from these files. And what we can do with it is we can ask, for example, what was the total number of occurrences of the word fish between the years 1850 and 1933? So in 1865, the word fish occurred 136,497 times, and that's some information that's contained in this file. Okay. By 1922, there were more books and more writing about fish, so there were 444,924 occurrences. There's also a total count history function that will tell you how many words there were across all books that Google knows about. So for example, in 1865, there were a total of, let's see, what is this? This is 2.5 billion or so words. So among all surviving texts that Google has scanned from the year 1865, there are about 2.5 billion distinct words. And I should note, these are not not distinct like they're different from each other. But I mean, in books, you have the word the and a and potato and the again and a and horse and fish. And so you add up all of those and you get 2.5 billion across all books. Now the relative popularity that we talked about in the previous video is just the quotient. So 136,497 uses of the word fish divided by 2.5 billion words total is the amount or the relative weight of the word fish in that year. So in other words, in the Google n-gram viewer, when I say fish, and I go between 1860 and 1870, we get some numbers, and we look at 1865, it was 0.0053%, which presumably is the same number that I have here. Let's try it out. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Right, so that's the same number. Okay, so that's why I'm expecting this value. And there's a couple other methods. For example, we want to be able to sum weight histories, and that's more something that we'll care about for project 2b. But we're going to have you write that method in this particular project. Okay. Now, we do provide some tests with our code. So for example, if we look at test time series and test n-gram map, there are some tests here, but I'll note that they're not comprehensive, but they should give you a pretty good idea of how you can write tests. And if you want to know how do I generate good test cases, well, for n-gram viewer at least, you can use the n-gram viewer. And here you go. Here's some values you can use. Okay. All right. Now, once you've written those two classes, you have built the data structures that you need for the project. And I guess I want to mention two more little things. So Ngram map, unlike time series, there's a lot of decisions you're going to have to make. And for those of you who are not as strong programmers, it's going to feel a little bewildering at first, because it's going to have the sense of like, where do I even start? Start with the constructor and start by trying to pick good instance variables. Now, how do you have any idea what you want to store and how to read the data? We also have just in great detail here, this is a description of what the files look like. And so there's two types of files we give you. The first are what are called words files. So I'm going to open one up here. If I go to ngrams and I look at very short, here's an example, very small ngrams data set. It only has the words airport, request, and wandered. And this is a good place to start. Try and read this file. And then we have bigger files, words that start with Q. This is a longer file, but not super big. And then we have much larger files, these two here. This is about 100 megabytes. This is about 300 megabytes. This is the top 49,887 words. Okay. So here, this is what this file looks like. And then we also have this total counts file, which tells you the total number of words. So for example, in 1478, we have 179,561 words, and these two values don't matter. But if you're curious what they mean, they're in the spec. Okay. So that is what the input files are going to look like. And because we haven't talked about how to read input files at all before, be aware that we've given you a file read demo. Okay. So Ngram map is going to be our first, I would say, software engineering experience where you're going to need to Google, you're going to need to look at example code, and you're going to have to do some experimentation. Okay. Now, when you write your Ngram map class, there's a few key things. One, your instance variables really matter. If you pick bad instance variables, which you won't know until you try to use them, your code will be 1, very slow, and 2, very hard to write. So be careful about how you design your instance variables for your class, and you may need to start over a couple of times. It's possible when you're writing methods. Okay. Now, I want to give you a couple of tips just based on my experience running a similar project in spring 2015, which is you really don't want variables that have what I'll call nested generic types. So if you have something that looks like hash map from blah to hash map blah blah, then probably what you actually want is a custom class, like maybe a time series. Okay, so if you start finding yourself doing something like this, take a deep breath, think about how a time series could be helpful. Okay. My other thing that I want to mention is that your methods should not reread the entire data files. So for example, whenever I do weight history, I should not reopen the file and go through and find instances of the word fish. The work really should happen in the constructor so that these methods can be very fast. Rereading the entire file for every single get operation, any weight history or count history operation is not the way to go. Okay. Now at the very end of the project, although I'm going to interrupt myself again, because basically that's the really hard part. I'd say time series will be somewhat time consuming. Ngram map could be pretty hard for some of you who are more expert, not so much. And so once you've done that, that's really the heart of Project 2a. And so in the next and final video in this little section, I'll talk about how you go back to doing the web stuff.